You're listening to the Nerd to Know Media Network.
Where did the idea of professional wrestling as a sport actually come from? Well, in the beginning it was a sport. But of course, for the purpose of this special report, we will be talking about professional wrestling as we know it. The WWF, the WWE, WCW, ECW, etc., etc. It appears that the idea of professional wrestling in a modern sense, as a sport, has come from three major places. The IWC, public perception, and the product itself. The pro wrestling media, or the IWC, often refer to this form of entertainment as a sport. They often question why professional wrestling is not seen in the same light as basketball or football, and indeed claim that it is counterproductive to not recognise it as a legitimate sport, as you can see on the screen right now. The next factor here is public perception. Either people completely buy into this as a sport, as is the case of younger kids, younger fans of the WWE, or believe that their company is completely different, that it's more of a sport. For example, fans of ZZW and Ring of Honor. And then of course you have the general public, who publicly decry the WWE, or wrestling as a whole. Just galvanises the two fan bases that I just mentioned. And that adds to a weird mentality that wrestling is more than just entertainment. And then there's the product itself. Now this is interesting. Since the days of Hogan and the WWF, wrestling was a closely guarded secret, where people did believe it was real, and the talent put that across. Since those days, pro wrestling has gone through a transformation from what people would recognise as a, quote, fake or predetermined form of entertainment to being classed as a pseudo-sport or an underground sport. ZZW is an ultra-violent promotion that emphasises this idea of an underground sport. Ultra-violence, of course, was brought to the mainstream by the WWF in the Attitude Era and by ECW to a lesser extent. And that had a profound effect on the world of professional wrestling, as you can hear from this clip of the Friday Fishbowl.
You know, how much further were you going to go? Where else was there to go once you started doing stuff that was just about on par with ECW? You really were going to have to kill somebody in the middle of the ring in order to get a pop out of people, because they were just so burnt out on anything that wasn't borderline homicide.
So what they did, they blew a Vince a I remember I didn't like the limo thing very much. Hunter loved it. I remember watching that going, whoa, like what are we doing? Like, to me, that was the ultimate, we've run out of ideas, so let's just blow up Vince in a limo. And yeah. I remember listening to an episode of Wrestling News Live around that same time, and wow, did I look at wrestling like a sport. I remember listening and going, whoa, I used to watch, and I found myself not enjoying wrestling so much by that point too. And then when I just kind of, I started to embrace it for what it was, I then really started to get into it more. And then when I would see other people around me say, oh, I don't know how you still watch that. And I'm like, well, because we all watched it as a sport. And when you stop watching it as a sport and when you watch it as what it's intended to be, which is entertainment, you're going to have a completely different perspective on it. And some people, like you said, can get there. And then, the examples you were giving, some people just can't. They just can't. It's the constant need of, I remember how it was. I want this to come back.
It is for these three major reasons that the perception of professional wrestling as a sport has developed. So it is the goal of us here on the Wrestleview International Desk and this special report to find out exactly what is professional wrestling. Okay guys, we are here in Rome, Italy to try and find out the answer to the question that we're posing in this special report. Is professional wrestling entertainment or sport? Well, no better society to use than the Romans, because they invented the idea of professional sports entertainment. We're going to look, is professional wrestling, much like gladiatorial combat, entertainment or is it sport? And why do we think of it as melded together?
Okay, so we're just over by the Colosseum and we actually found one of Italy's talking statues. Now these are really cool. They're like a forerunner to forums or the IWC. Basically, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, what you would do is they'd have little marble slabs here, and you could write anything you wanted to a certain degree. You could criticize the government, you could basically say anything. So it's funny to think that we might have had old Roman guys basically just writing on these statues saying, you know, I don't think they should push Brutus Maximus as much as they are. They're making him look like too strong a gladiator. We need to see him lose. Or, I think the lion matches are being used too much. We have to see one every couple months or else it loses its effect. So, it's amazing to think hundreds of years ago.
Okay everybody, we are here at Laurentini at the Museum of Roman Civilization. This was built by Benito Mussolini for the exact purpose of making replicas. So this whole museum here actually has a series of replicas for the Colosseum, Circus Maximus, Circus Domitian. We're going to go in now and have a look at them. I'm trying to give you guys an idea of what sites like the Colosseum looked in the heyday. So let's get to it.
Outside the Colosseum in Rome, and I'm joined by Ben, who is a tour guide and friend of Darragh's. He's just going to explain to us a few things about the gladiatorial combat that took place in the Colosseum. And now, Ben, how popular were the games in Rome? How popular were, you know, the gladiatorial combat in Rome?
I would think they're very popular. I mean, the Colosseum behind us sits between 50 and 80,000. In a city that at the time was less than 1 million people, you know, that holds quite a lot of the population. The tickets are always free, so people didn't have to pay to go and see it, so it'd always be very full.
Okay, and how were the games viewed in Roman society?
They would have been well liked by a lot of the people, otherwise, you know, you wouldn't need something of this size to sort of produce so much passion amongst people. I mean, some people didn't like it. You do get writings from people like Seneca, who despised the games and thought it was just brutality. And the Greeks in Rome always preferred their sort of theatre and comedy and drama. But an awful lot of the just normal Romans just saw this as general entertainment.
Okay, and in your opinion, would the games be more classified as entertainment solely for the purposes of entertainment, or is it a true athletic contest? Or maybe it falls somewhere in between. What's your opinion on that?
I would think it falls somewhere in between. Like modern sports, it's seen as entertainment. I mean, they did keep records of victories, losses, and people were fighting for prizes. I mean, these guys were actually athletes and sportsmen. They weren't just random men coming off the streets just to sort of entertain other people. And yet, like modern football, rugby and such, people came along to actually, you know, go and see these games as entertainment, as a sport.
Gladiatorial contests were the most popular sporting events in ancient Rome. They were not for the faint-hearted, and from the best as we can figure out were bloody and violent as they have been made out to be. Based on the analysis of the number of gladiatorials fought in a single event, it has been estimated that each gladiatorial contest lasted between 10 to 15 minutes. Long matches were simply too exhausting. The first record of a gladiatorial contest was in 264 BC. The government staged gladiatorial battles 3 or 4 times a year. Spectators were often led into their stadiums and the Colosseums for free to win their support and to keep them pacified. The last one recorded was in AD 404. Gladiatorial battles were at first a Roman invention. They were a solemn affair held at the funerals as a blood offering to the rich Roman. By the time of the Colosseum, however, hundreds of smaller amphitheatres had popped up throughout the Roman Empire, and these had their heyday in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. People enjoyed the sport so much that they filled their homes with floor mosaics and frescoes of bloody gladiatorial scenes. William Grimes of the New York Times wrote, quote, "The gladiator was a contradictory figure. Socially he was the despised outcast, but the warrior code and the unflinching courage displayed by most gladiators made them in a sense ideal Romans. Not surprisingly, gladiators captured the public imagination. They were celebrities. Young women left amorous graffiti on the walls of gladiatorial schools. Winners of gladiatorial contests received palm branches and sometimes prizes. Successful gladiators not only got to live, but they also became sporting celebrities. Over time, gladiatorial sport became professionalised, with managers, fixed schedules, tours and training centres. A variety of gladiatorial contests were staged. The combatants fought in specific categories, each with certain rules, weapons and armour. In other words, there were divisions. It wasn't just a free-for-all, like is often taught. In the Colosseum, it was the best of the best. You would not always have a fight to the death. People preferred the spectacle of the show. Having these different gladiators going against each other was more appealing than having a quick 5-minute match. So they'd spread out the whole day. Other contests that were held in the Colosseum that did often end in death were contests with animals. Unarmed men battled starving lions. The odds were tipped in the favour of the lions. Sometimes lawbreakers were fed to the animals as a deterrent to keep them from breaking the law. Aside from the gladiatorial combat, there were public executions, which often were incredibly graphic. They are called deadly charades. When it became top billed in the Colosseum, when it was professionalised, you would have gladiators like you see up on screen. Name gladiators. These were big deals, major names in the arena. Your John Cena's, your Hulk Hogan's, your Stone Cold Steve Austin's. When you have gladiators of this calibre, you wanted to try to get as much mileage out of these guys as you could. It's who people wanted to see, it's who they looked up to. Much like any other sport today, or more realistically, much like any professional wrestler today. Of course you had your undercard, and this is where death would have happened. Also, outside of Rome, outside of the Colosseum, that's where you'd have the major death in these events. But when it was on the grand scale, when it was the WrestleMania event, which would be the main event in the Colosseum, death was very unimportant, and they were protected through a series of staged combat, different fighting styles, the show itself, and carefully regulated matches. Now, if you have a look down here, you'll be able to see where it was actually done, where the backstage area was staged. You had the backstage area, the curtain where all the guys would hang out and then come out to a cheering crowd. This could hold 50,000 people at its peak. This is the Madison Square Gardens of the ancient world. Also remember too, the amphitheaters literally means hunting arena. And theaters, where we get the idea of Greek play, were banned in Rome originally until Pompey built his own theatre. So the early games of the amphitheaters had to incorporate theatrical elements. And today, if you look at any sport, you will not get elements from the gladiatorial games. If you look at professional wrestling, you will get entertainment, show and spectacle.
So we saw from the previous interview, gladiatorial combat was more about the spectacle than anything else. It evolved from being a real-life sport with real-life death and real-life injury to being this theatrical play almost, where Caesar's top guys wouldn't really get hurt, because if you have a guy who's like the gladiatorial equivalent to John Cena, you don't want him getting hurt. Like, think about today. John Cena can't take a week off without the dirt sheets speculating over anything, and that it would have been like that years and years ago. You wouldn't see your top guy losing. Hulk Hogan never got beaten clean because he was Hulk Hogan. You wouldn't beat, Brutus Maximus clean. That just wouldn't happen. And that carried over now to a professional wrestling where you would see guys, not get beaten clean. They would go years and years. Rowdy Roddy Piper went 9 years without getting beaten clean, because it's not about the sport, it's about the spectacle. And that's what happened. It evolved from being a sport to being a spectacle. People talk about Brock Lesnar being sponsored by Jimmy John's as if it's something new and, desecrating the sport. But that used to happen in gladiatorial combat all the time. These top guys would be sponsored by olive oil companies, and there was a deleted scene in the film Gladiator that actually said as much, and it was deleted because people wouldn't think it's realistic. But that actually happened. So, as you can see from the previous interview, and we are in the Colosseum where all of this would have happened. Wrestling is essentially the same thing as gladiatorial combat. That's why it's called the squared circle, guys.
report, we've come to Villa Borghese, and in Villa Borghese it actually has a copy of the Globe Theatre, where William Shakespeare had all his plays in the original theatre, of course, in England. Now, the reason why we've come here is because we've come full circle. We've seen throughout this course of the special report that gladiatorial combat followed a very similar path to sports, entertainment, or professional wrestling as we know it. It began as a human sacrifice, then became a sport, then was fused very subtly with entertainment. So we had to come to Rome, Italy to figure it out. But now professional wrestling can be identified as what we've always said it was, a soap opera with punching, or theatre. I'm Darragh O'Connor. See you next time.
Join us at nerdtoknowmedia.com.